today we are looking at Parshat Bo, and um, I in my sort of later years of teaching started really finding last week's portion and or yes, just a couple days portion and the bow a little problematic because I started really thinking about what plagues mean, but we're not going to look at plagues. Um, I wanted to I kind of got caught up in the now I don't have it in front of me. So the chapter 12 verses 35 and 36, which basically is the it's when the Israelites are about to leave Egypt, and and they're fleeing, um and they ask their Egyptian neighbors and previous masters and whoever, for they use the word by yeshlu, which the word she'ela is a question. It's the root is about question, but this means request or demand, for gold and silver and all kinds of other things, which end up being used later for the golden calf, but also for creating the Mishkan much later on. And the response seems to be like, oh yeah, sure, here. So I started thinking about that because what they're talking about is reparations and the idea of reparations. There was a great injustice done to the Israelites for over 250 years, being made slaves, and and it's kind of like, the end of, after the plagues and after the firstborns were killed, there's like this sort of a feeling of haste, of rapidity, like, you need to get out of here really quick. And and then to, in the midst of that, go ask the Egyptians for, and it's, I'm sorry, I'm having like stumbling word problems, but in the midst of it, go ask for or demand or request their, things that are probably very valuable to the Egyptians. And I'm not saying it's wrong to or right to, it's just an interesting thing. And all the texts that I've come across, and I've looked at a few, they use the word, instead of request or demand, they use the translation to borrow, which I think is really an interesting, it kind of puts a little bit of a positive, I guess, if you can make it positive, intent on it. So I did I certainly want us to discuss this, but I want to just go through a couple notes that I made because I went through a whole bunch of books and commentaries. So when I started reading about reparations, which is actually a very important topic that's being discussed in today's world, that reparations for the slavery of the of Black people in the US, reparations for Holocaust survivors, reparations for all kinds of things, for people who have been dislocated from their homes, and I hope that they're talking about reparations for Native Americans. I actually didn't have a chance to Google that. But it's also, there's all these R words that came up, and they all start with RE, which is, it's just a really interesting. So reparations certainly is something that came up. Retribution is another word that might be used, that they, were taken. Redemption, are the Egyptians redeeming themselves? Is this the Israelites' road to redemption to do this? Repudiation, rebellion and repentance. So those words all came up in all the different people that I looked at, especially Aviva Zornberg did a lot of work on the language that was used in this Torah portion, but she really focused mostly on, she wasn't really focusing on the reparations part. So and so I'm like, what is going on here, I guess. Rashi comments that the Israelites despoiled the Egyptians, which is an interesting turn also. And I also looked up, what actually is reparations? They're meant to acknowledge and acknowledge and have consequences of human rights violations and inequity. So there's lots of that's a lot. There's a lot of inequity in this world. So how far back do we go when we're demanding reparations, and where do you draw a line? Because generations later, there's a lot of, it's the later generations certainly have benefited from their ancestors, but are they responsible for some of it? So anyways, I just I wanted to bring that up. I wanted to throw it out there. The other little thing, which we don't have to talk about, but if we do have time, I don't think we will, is the idea of an omnipotent God, and God hardened Pharaoh's heart, not Pharaoh, especially in the second half of the plagues. And God, was the enactor of these plagues, and God parted the Red Sea. So why is it that all these horrible things have to happen in order to prove God's omnipotence? I mean, Red Sea was not horrible, but it did close back over, or at least it says it did, over people. And one of the things I came up with, which I thought was very interesting, that it was not totally to show God as being powerful to the Egyptians, but more so to the Israelites. So that's a thought. Maybe we can discuss it next year. So I'm flinging the door open. Please comment. Please talk about this. No, yes. Does anyone feel that it was wrong to ask the Egyptians, that it was right to provide their valuables to the Israelites? Go ahead, Barb.
So in the Eitz Chaim, it says that a third of the Egyptians actually willingly gave the gold and silver, as opposed to the third who wanted the Israelites out of there, and the other third who supposedly joined with them to go on the journey, so to speak. So I kind of lost my where I was going with this. Anyway, for whatever that's worth.
So that sounds like a hopeful view of humankind.
Yeah, a little bit apologetic in some ways, but yeah.
But you figure if 2/3 of the population were either in with them or helping them,
And there is reportedly some Egyptians that went with them. I believe I've read that, according to the commentary. All of this is like, all we do is depend on the commentary, and sometimes I don't agree with the what the commentators' take is on things, so I log down there.
But you can always find another commentator, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
Julie, thanks for it's Roberta. Hi, thanks
Yeah,
for
hi, Roberta.
Hi, thanks for opening the book this way. Last week, I was really lucky to study with Malila Hellner, who many of us might remember when Rabbi Jonathan brought her to WJC to be the scholar in residence like 20 years ago. And she is in North Carolina teaching. Anyway, last week we went over what were the steps that Pharaoh took to enslave the Hebrews, right? Because at the beginning of Exodus, they're not enslaved; they're free people in Egypt, and how there was this systematic buy-in, like the first thing, I think, even before making the labor harder, or at the same time, was to Pharaoh said to the Egyptians, you can now use the labor of these people in your own houses. And I think just kind of in line with what you're talking about, Julie, like there's one thing going on between Pharaoh and the Hebrews. There's a whole other thing from the beginning going on between the Egyptians and the Hebrews. And I think it is so relevant for all of us, right? To especially Jewish people. I mean, I grew up, we didn't enslave the blacks. I mean, I grew up with there was pride that the Jewish Americans didn't do that. And then of course, living in the South, I'm seeing a very different story, but just how is the system built up, and how do you bring in the rank and file to actually benefit from the system? And I think it's such a beautiful thing that this, now we're in, the next Parsha, that, the Egyptian people, there was always some understanding that, that they're in this, in the way the Hebrews are. So I celebrate this part of the story, and I'm glad you brought it up. And yeah, I've read the Midrash, that the mixed multitudes that left, that included all these people, the people who gave their stuff, and that they were part of the whole journey. So thank you.
Yeah. It's something that just goes over, when we're reading this, we always tend to focus on Pharaoh's heart, or on the plagues. And this was the first time that I actually really focused in on that part. So I'm glad to do that. Meg?
Yeah, this is so interesting, because yesterday I was talking with my friend who's very involved with resettlement of immigrants from different countries in New Haven. And in her synagogue, which is, I can't remember if it's Reconstructionist or conservative.
I used to
Someone
belong to
was
that one.
someone was speaking who has retired from the department. She's an attorney who worked for reparations for survivors of the Holocaust for many, many years. And they're trying to, she's now working with people who are looking for, to figure out, how can we figure out what kind of reparations could be given to the ancestors of people who are enslaved, and what can they learn from the way it was done for the people who had been German citizens, or the survivors of those people. And one of the things was very interesting. She told me that in Evanston, Illinois apparently is the first place where reparations are being given to residents, African-American residents, who have historically been prohibited from buying homes. They've been redlined. They have not been able to get, the kind of housing they want because of the discrimination against Blacks. And that was that's like one small category that they decided that's how they are going to deal with reparations. And so that was very interesting. And I certainly know that in California also, there are several groups that are really looking at how can we figure out reparations. So it was interesting that this woman is trying to use some of the model, because things were given to different people in so many different ways, from Holocaust survivors. Some people are still receiving things up to today, benefits and all kinds of things. So it's interesting. So thank you for bringing this up anyway.
Miriam.
Let's see. A couple of years ago, Rabbi Jonathan pointed out that when there was a drought, it affected all the people and it affected all the Egyptians. So the Egyptians basically became wards of the Pharaoh and Joseph, so that it's not as if they lived in abundance during the drought. And so I'm wondering how this folds in these generations later, that I have no answer, but I just want to remind us that the Egyptians were not as if, they had to pay the Pharaoh. They had to buy grains. They lost everything too. So that somehow is in this mix, I'm sure.
But I think that goes to the fact that when you have a dictator or totalitarian regime, that everybody or most people suffer.
Yeah.
The text actually says pretty explicitly that they all become essentially serfs under Joseph, that it is Joseph who says, this is what you've got to do if you're going to survive the famine. So the Egyptians themselves are not free at the beginning of Exodus. And then there's more about the Hebrews becoming enslaved, but it isn't as if the Egyptians are free. They're not. They've lost their freedom also. But there's something else. So there's a whole much more story in here than we usually pay attention to.
Yeah.
Of the whole people losing something, being in Mitzrayim, really. But Julie, I really something connected for me when you went back to the borrowed and that it was used for the Mishkan, so much of it. Obviously the cattle weren't, they came out with lots and lots and lots of cattle, but it is the gold and stuff. There's an implication, that it was not used it was not for the Hebrews as loot. It was going to be part of the reparation, was ultimately to have all of this stuff being used in worship of the one who gives freedom, and I never had put that together. I've always been very puzzled by the use of the word.
And
So
that's
thank
the
you.
reason that Moses gives Pharaoh at the beginning. Our people need to go worship God.
Yeah.
You need to let them go so they can worship God. And or source of life, whatever, however you phrase it. And that is, and a lot of the conversation between Moses and Pharaoh, as far as I can remember, is this, well, why do you have to take, why do the women have to go? Why, and the children have to go? Why can't it just be the men that go? Or why, why do you need to take cattle? Well, you can go, but you can't take the cattle, that kind of thing. So that was, so it's good that I'm glad you caught that. That's interesting.
There's
I
also
was oh, sorry, Gail. Just what you're sparking so much for me, Gail and Julie, like that the Torah says, a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Pharaoh, who did not know Joseph, right? And I'm just thinking, it doesn't say that the Egyptian people don't remember Joseph. And there's such a mix in there, as Gail was saying, just so much of how I think we as contemporaries read Torah, we're looking for the voices and the stories of the people who are left out. And, just really looking at, what's going on for the Egyptian people who are continually highlighted, like, and there's so much midrash, right, that says Shifra and Puah, the midwives themselves, were Egyptian. That no way would Pharaoh have ordered Hebrew midwives to enact his greatest coup, that these ones, Pharaoh would have relied on, Egyptian midwives who were in with the Hebrew people. So there's just so much here. And I just also want to say that wasn't the gold also used though from the Egyptians for the golden calf?
Yeah.
And I think there's an incredible Torah teaching in this that what do you do with reparations? What do they stand for you? That everything that comes out of the system of enslavement is tainted, and what do we do with it? I think that's a great caution. And by the way, Asheville, I'm back in Asheville, has the county and the town. We are going forward with reparations all over the South. It did, Evanston, I think, was the first place, as Meg said, but it's on fire all over the South. It's a major issue. It's affecting the elections hugely, the divide between blacks and whites and allies of blacks and the election. It's a big issue here in the South.
Yeah.
Thanks,
So,
Helen.
if anyone else has something, Gail, did you want to say something else?
Just that at the time of the Revolutionary War, I have read that 1/5 of the population of New York City were enslaved.
Mm,
Yeah,
So much for the North.
for the North, and it's a real question, I think. This isn't what I was going to say, but it's one of them. Whether 2/3 of the people now would support reparation for Black people is probably dubious in this country. But in Toyrah, there was a line I noticed this week, which is as Pharaoh says, okay, you guys can go. And he says, and you can go 3 days away. And then he says, and pray for me.
oh, I didn't catch that.
Yeah. And there are also looking for that places where Pharaoh calls Moses and said to them, I sinned this time. And there's another place where he also says, so where Moses is, the language seems wrong, but calling himself out. And it's something else, as Gail was saying, that that everybody is saying, that we don't usually notice, that Pharaoh is somewhat self-aware of his part in this. And I will say, coming from family where we got reparations, there's twin high rises near the George Washington Bridge, and those were always referred to as reparation towers, that
Really?
people in Washington Heights took their money and bought those co-ops or condos, whatever they were, and they were just always called Reparation Tower. So I'll have to see if I can find that initial line of Pharaoh saying, and pray for me, but that's there at, I think, 3 places where Pharaoh says something like that in the translation.
Well, if we believe that Pharaoh's heart was being hardened against his will, then maybe he was, but that's probably for next time. I have to get to work, so I'm gonna, you guys can stay on and talk, but I have to figure out how to get to a patient.
Oh, and I
So
have a 10 o'clock Zoom. Okay.
yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.